This is a photograph of Hadamar Psychiatric Hospital in Germany, taken sometime during the Second World War. That black smoke roiling from the chimney is produced by combusting human flesh. Sometime in 1941, the staff of Hadamar held a ceremony to mark the murder of the 10,000th patient. The naked body of a murdered patient lay on a stretcher covered with flowers, and a staff member dressed as a priest performed a mock ceremony. A local polka band provided entertainment, and the beer and wine flowed freely. This was all part of the Nazi Action T4 program for the mass murder of the mentally ill. This is Ernst Rudin, the director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Psychiatry. Rudin was the dean of German psychiatry. All the levers of power came back to Ernst Rudin. It was he who wrote the German law mandating the sterilization of the mentally ill and other quote-unquote undesirables. And it was his work that provided the ideological justification for the T4 program, an undertaking that led directly to the Holocaust. I am not accusing any of his modern-day successors of being his moral equivalent. I merely wish to make the point that genetic determinist views of human nature can have unforeseen consequences. Is mental illness, are people with schizophrenia and other so-called mental illnesses really born that way? What does it even mean to say that? These questions form the basis of my book, Madness and Genetic Determinism. Is mental illness in our genes? I chose to concentrate on schizophrenia, which of all those conditions called mental illness, I think it's fair to say, is considered the one most likely to have a biological or genetic basis. If schizophrenia turns out to have a strong genetic component, that would bolster the case for looking for the genetic bases of other mental illnesses. If, on the other hand, genetic determinist theories fail here, they are likely to be even weaker elsewhere. Now, before we go any further, I just want to give you some idea where I'm going. I have divided the history of psychiatric genetics into two eras. The pre-molecular biology era, which I call, for lack of a better term, the classical genetics era, comprises family studies, twin studies, and adoption studies. The molecular biology era comprises linkage studies, candidate gene studies, and genome-wide association studies. Pre-Mendelian theories of the inheritance of mental illness will not be considered here. Getting back to Ernst Rudin, in 1909, he succeeded Alois Alzheimer as senior physician at the Munich hospital under the tutelage of Emil Kraepelin, the psychiatrist who wrote the book that is widely regarded as the forerunner of the DSM. Armed with the newly rediscovered laws of genetics, modern statistical methods of data analysis, and Kraepelin's nosology of mental illness, Rudin went to work. He studied 701 families with a diagnosed case of dementia praecox, as schizophrenia was known then, drawn from the Munich hospital as well as the district insane asylum. He gathered information about the patients and their family members from hospital records, schools, government offices, and police reports. Working from this pastiche of secondhand information, most of it gathered by individuals who were not medical professionals, Rudin felt qualified to render psychiatric diagnoses of individuals he's never met, many of whom were long dead. And when he analyzed the data, he concluded that they best fit a two-locus model in which the schizophrenia allele was recessive at both loci. In fairness to Rudin, I should point out, he maintained these findings were only preliminary, a mere working hypothesis. But that did not prevent these findings from being used to support an agenda of forcible sterilization and so-called mercy killing with far-reaching consequences. In 1918, Rudin was made director of genealogical and demographic studies at the German Institute for Psychiatric Research, later renamed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. And in 1931, he succeeded his former mentor Kraepelin as director of the institute. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of the Reich. And on June 3rd of that same year, Rudin was appointed to the Standing Committee for Racial Hygiene. Rudin wrote the law mandating forcible sterilization of quote-unquote undesirables, which was a category that included individuals with congenital mental defects, schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, hereditary epilepsy, hereditary chorea, hereditary blindness, hereditary deafness, severe physical deformity, and severe alcoholism. Up until that point, sterilization had been illegal in Germany. And in fairness, I suppose I ought to point out that this law was patterned after similar laws already on the books in the United States of America at the time. Hundreds of genetic health courts were established, each one consisting of 2 doctors and a lawyer. The quote-unquote patient had no right to legal representation or even to see the evidence presented against him. Not surprisingly, the courts decided for sterilization in over 90% of cases. Between 300,000 and 400,000 patients were sterilized, some of them by means of X-rays beamed at them without their knowledge as they were standing behind counters filling out forms, a procedure that sometimes resulted in massive burns. Perioperative mortality was reported to be on the order of 1 in 200, which would mean something like 1,500 to 2,000 patients died. This is Franz Coleman, a visiting scientist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute and a protege of Rudin's. In 1935, at the International Congress of Population Problems in Berlin, Coleman proposed that schizophrenia was caused by a single recessive gene. And he advocated sterilization not just of the quote-unquote homozygotes, but also of asymptomatic heterozygous carriers of this hypothesized schizophrenia gene, which he claimed could be identified by means of subtle physical deformities. At this point, Fritz Lenz, professor of genetics at the University of Göttingen, rose to object. Now, before I go any further, I should point out that in the year that was to follow, Lenz and his pal Rudin were to oversee the forcible sterilization of hundreds of children of German women and French African colonial troops stationed in that nation after the First World War. So Lenz was not a good guy. There were no good guys in this sorry mess. But anyway, this is what Lenz had to say. He pointed out that the consensus figure for the lifetime incidence of a diagnosis of schizophrenia appears to be on the order of 1 in 100. So if this condition really is caused by a recessive gene, and you want to sterilize all the heterozygotes, you would have to sterilize almost 1 person out of every 5. The proposal was shelved, although Rudin's enthusiasm for sterilization was not. But then Hitler decided that sterilization of the undesirables was not going far enough. And in 1933, he directed his chief of the chancellery, Philipp Bühler, to develop a program to kill the mentally ill and other handicapped adults. Bühler convened a secret meeting with a number of prominent German physicians, most of them psychiatrists, all of them eminently credentialed authorities in their field, and all of whom pledged their full cooperation. These included Max de Krinis, director of the Psychiatric University Clinic at Cologne, Valentin Falthauser, director of the Kaufbeuren District Hospital, Bertold Kien, director of the Psychiatric University Hospital at Jena, Werner Heide, director of the Psychiatric Hospital at Würzburg, Paul Nietzsche, deputy director of the Sonnenstein Clinic, Karl Schneider, Department of Psychiatry, chair of psychiatry at Heidelberg, and Wilhelm Bender, director of the Psychiatric Clinic at the Berlin Buch State Hospital. And this program became known as the Action T4 program. 6 quote-unquote mercy killing centers were established, each equipped with undressing rooms, along with a gas chamber disguised as a shower room and a crematorium. The decision of who was to live and who was to die was made on the basis of a one-page form filled out by a junior doctor and supposedly reviewed by a senior doctor who might approve of hundreds of such forms in the course of a month, or thousands of such forms in the course of a month. The Charitable Foundation for the Transport of Patients, known by the German acronym GECRAT, was established to convey the victims to the killing centers. The GECRAT buses were painted gray with the GECRAT logo printed clearly on the side. As the GECRAT buses rolled past, little kids would yell, "There goes the murder box." At the killing centers, patients might be greeted by nurses offering coffee and sweet rolls. Doctors would conduct a cursory physical examination of each patient, and then the patients would be herded into the undressing rooms and then into the shower rooms with the promise of getting their clothes back after showering. In the shower rooms, the patients were murdered by means of carbon monoxide gas supplied by IG Farben. Hospital bookkeepers meticulously filled out death certificates for each victim. The gold fillings were removed from the teeth of the victims and sold to help finance the program, and the brains of the victims were sent to prestigious medical centers for dissection. It perhaps does not quite go without saying that all of the embedding, sectioning, and staining the scientists did of brain tissue, and all the hours they spent peering down the barrels of microscopes, brought mankind not 1 inch closer to understanding the etiology of schizophrenia or of devising a cure. Faced with rising opposition, Hitler secretly ordered an end to the T4 program on August 24th, 1941. The surreptitious killing of mental patients and other handicapped adults and children by means of starvation and lethal injection continued even after the end of the war. Now, it should be kept in mind that the T4 decree did not require German psychiatrists to kill anybody. It authorized them to do so, an authority which they proceeded to exercise with unbridled enthusiasm. It should also be kept in mind that the psychiatrists who ran the program were not cranks or fringe figures. These were not mad scientists operating in some castle in Transylvania. These were men with impeccable academic credentials and national and even international reputations. To this day, Rudin's work continues to be cited as evidence for the hereditary nature of schizophrenia. At the doctor's trial at Nuremberg, Philipp Buhler, Hitler's former chief of staff, told the court, "We're not the regular professors of the universities with the program. Who was more qualified than they?" He was hanged. And what about Franz Coleman? Where was he while all this was going on? He had already fled Germany years before this to avoid persecution as an undesirable himself due to his German ancestry. Coleman had to flee Germany one step ahead of the Gestapo, but he doesn't seem to have felt any malice toward Rudin, and in fact, he testified as a character witness on behalf of his former boss at Rudin's denazification hearing in 1947. Being on the wrong end of eugenics policies doesn't seem to have changed Coleman's mind about the subject. He secured a position at the Columbia University Medical Center, and in 1938, he published The Genetics of Schizophrenia, the first English language account of his work. In the foreword, he circumspectly notes that political developments in Germany had closed to me the possibility to complete my research there, and he thanks his former boss, Rudin, for his help and advice, before promising us that an understanding of the hereditary etiology of schizophrenia will put us on the path to a cure. Coleman and his associates studied a group of 1,087 schizophrenic probands, as well as their families. They interviewed as many of the probands as they could, and they also collated information from clinical histories, police reports, school records, consulates, and so forth. Like Rudin before him, Coleman felt qualified to render psychiatric diagnoses of individuals he never met, most of whom were long dead, as well as their family members. Coleman describes the arduousness of the task. Endless negotiations had to be conducted before the persons in question were convinced that a genetic investigation of the family was both important and harmless. Quite a few were bad-humored, unpleasant, and obstinate. He never mentions that all this is a perfectly reasonable reaction to nosy strangers showing up on your doorstep and asking intrusive and quite likely dangerous questions. Coleman tallied the number of relatives of the probands that he judged belonged to the class of quote-unquote schizoid personalities, which he divided into two categories: schizoid eccentrics and borderline cases, and schizoid psychopaths. His category of schizoid borderline cases included cranks and eccentrics, stubborn and perverse recalcitrants, malicious and cold-hearted despots, superstitious and pietistic religiomaniacs, secretive reclusives, sectarian dreamers out of touch with reality, and the over-pedantic, avaricious, and literal-minded people. His schizoid psychopaths included unsociable, cold-hearted, indecisive, and fanatic types, bull-headed oafs, malicious tyrants, queer cranks, over-pedantic schemers, prudish model children, and daydreamers out of all touch with reality. Is this the language of science? Or is this the language of a man who is consumed with anger and hatred toward his fellow man and who has set himself upon a quest to rid the world of what he sees as the source of that anger? Can this grab bag of ill-defined categories really be the work of a single gene? Coleman thought so. And when he analyzed the data, he concluded that schizophrenics possessed 2 copies of the quote-unquote schizophrenia gene, and those with schizoid personalities only 1. Now, having satisfied himself that schizophrenia was caused by genes, Coleman then turned his attention to the matter of what we should do about this problem. Now, Coleman made it clear he did not endorse the kind of forcible sterilization program that was going on in his native Germany at the time. Instead, he recommended counseling and education, with forcible sterilization being reserved only for those incorrigibles who would not accept voluntary sterilization. The problem with family studies, such as Rudine's and Coleman's, is that they prove nothing. Or at most, they prove that a trait runs in families, which is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for its having a genetic basis. Speaking English runs in families, but nobody pretends there's a gene for that. Indeed, the "it runs in the family" argument is the very basis of scientific racism. The idea that because poverty or lack of formal education or violent crime conviction rates run in families, then these conditions must have a genetic basis. But all this ignores the obvious fact that family members share an enormous amount of environmental variability in common, making it impossible to disentangle the twin threads of heredity and environment. The central assumption underlying family studies, that familial equals genetic, is false. Coleman subsequently turned his attention to twin studies. These studies have long held an allure for researchers who wish to disentangle the twin threads of heredity and environment. Now, as I'm sure you all know, there are 2 types of twins: monozygotic or identical twins who share 100% of their genes identical by descent, and dizygotic or fraternal twins who share 50% of their genes identical by descent. The number of twin pairs in which both members share the trait, divided by the number of twin pairs in which at least one member has the trait, is called the concordance rate. Twin researchers believe that by comparing concordance rates in monozygotic twin pairs with those of dizygotic twin pairs, that same-sex dizygotic twin pairs, that they can calculate the heritability of a trait or the proportion of variation in the population that is due to genetic variation. Twin researchers assume that the environments experienced by monozygotic twin pairs are no more similar than those experienced by dizygotic twin pairs. This assumption, called the equal environment assumption, is the bedrock foundation of twin studies. What was Coleman's motivation for performing this research? He explained this in a 1942 paper. As soon as we shall be able to duplicate or sufficiently reinforce the herito-constitutional mechanisms responsible for a satisfactory resistance to the disintegrating effects of a schizophrenic process, the therapeutic problem of schizophrenia will be nearer its final solution. Coleman looked at 174 dizygotic twin pairs and 517 monozygotic twin pairs, in which at least one member of each pair had received a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And he reported that the concordance rate for dizygotic twin pairs was 15%, same-sex dizygotic pairs, whereas that for monozygotic twin pairs was a staggering 86%, which he considered overwhelming evidence for a genetic basis for schizophrenia, which was manifested in most, but not all, cases. What are we to make of Coleman's results? The first point we need to consider is that no other study has come close to replicating Coleman's reported 86% concordance rate. In fact, no study performed after 1962 has reported a concordance rate even as high as 25%. In plain English, if one member of a pair of identical twins has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, odds are better than 3 out of 4 that the remaining member will not be so diagnosed. This is hardly evidence for a strong genetic component to schizophrenia. Now, a number of workers have pointed out some flaws in some problems with twin studies that could account for the wildly inflated concordance rates reported by Coleman and some other workers. We don't have time to go into them all, so let's just cut to the chase. We've already noted that the entire field of twin studies is based on an assumption that the environments experienced by monozygotic twin pairs are no more similar than those experienced by dizygotic twin pairs. Well, anybody who knows anything about life as it is lived knows that that is not true. And it's almost overkill to point out that a mountain of empirical studies have confirmed what common sense already tells us. The central assumption underlying twin studies, the equal environment assumption, is false. As for Coleman, he never lost his enthusiasm for his chosen mission of improving the human gene pool. In January of 1945, as the Holocaust continued to operate full speed ahead, he wrote, "Psychiatric eugenics appears to be safely on the march." He continued to write an annual review on the subject for the next 19 years. When he died in 1965, his obituary in Eugenics Quarterly noted, "The distinguished career of Dr. Franz J. Coleman as a researcher and teacher came to a close with his death on May 12th. His contributions to the field of human genetics were established with his classic work on the genetics of schizophrenia. By 1936, his opposition to Nazi laws requiring compulsory sterilization of mentally ill patients had made his position in his native Germany scientifically untenable. Coming to the United States, he almost single-handedly founded the discipline of psychiatric genetics in this country." Now, before we leave the era of twin studies entirely, we would be remiss if we did not consider the most famous case history in all of psychiatric genetics, the Jeannine Sisters. Like the story of the Kallikak family, the sad, sordid tale of the Jeannine Sisters was intended to illustrate the primacy of heredity, but in fact it revealed much more about its chroniclers than about its purported subjects. The Jeannine Sisters were a set of 4 identical quadruplets, born in 1930, all 4 of whom were diagnosed with schizophrenia in their early 20s, and who were brought to the National Institutes of Health for 3 years of intensive study. Their story is told in this book. The Jeannine Quadruplets, a case study and theoretical analysis of heredity and environment in schizophrenia, edited by David Rosenthal, a research psychologist at the National Institute of Mental Health. 25 different researchers contributed to this volume: psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, a geneticist, a physiologist, a statistician, a social science analyst, and a handwriting analyst. It's a massive tome, over 600 pages in length. The name Jeannine is derived from the Greek words genos and anos, and literally means dire birth. The parents were identified by the pseudonyms Henry and Gertrude, and the 4 sisters were identified by pseudonyms as well: Nora, Iris, Myra, and Hester. Notice that the initial letters of their names spells out the abbreviation for the National Institute of Mental Health. The book begins with a story of their lives, and it's all here in black and white. 125 pages of abuse that began literally when these girls were in the cradle and their father knocked their heads together to keep them from crying, and continued right up until the time they were taken to the NIH. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. Henry kept his wife and daughters in line with threats to murder them, and nobody doubted that he was capable of such an act. He almost certainly did murder another man, details in my book, and for the rest of his life, he would wake up screaming from nightmares of murder, demand his gun, and search the house for intruders. He once fired that gun at his wife, later claiming he thought she was a burglar. He missed, although he did succeed in putting a hole in her nightgown. The girls were never allowed to play with other children after school, not even their own cousins, and they grew up socially isolated with no real friends. They were tormented by boys who would knock their books out of their hands, push them down the stairs, throw food at them. One of the sisters, known in the book as Hester, was a favorite target for her father's anger. He became obsessed with preventing her from masturbating, and he would punish her severely for this behavior. Beatings, holding her head underwater, pouring carbolic acid on her vulva. Hester began engaging in sex acts with her sister Iris, and the family doctor ordered surgical mutilations of the genitals for both of them. When Hester broke her stitches in the hospital, the doctor threatened to fix her now, and he prescribed sedatives for Hester and her sister. He also instructed Gertrude to tie the girls' hands at night. All 4 of the sisters were raped or sexually assaulted. Hester as a child, the other 3 as young women. And what did their father do about this? What did this tough guy, with his badge and gun, who was obsessed with his daughter's virginity, do about any of this? Nothing. His daughter Nora was sexually assaulted in the municipal building where they both worked. When she told him, he sneered, "Just shut your mouth and get back to work." By this time, Henry was downing 16 bottles of beer a day, and his daughter Hester was tasked with cleaning up the sink after he had vomited in it in the course of his many drunken binges. She also had the job of cleaning out her father's smelly spittoon every day. Once he became angry at her and kicked a frying pan out of her hand, chipping a tooth. One by one, all the sisters suffered nervous breakdowns, and at least 2 of them were hospitalized and subjected to dozens of sessions of electroshock therapy. The doctors attributed the girl's problems to menstrual difficulties or excessive masturbation, anything except abuse. Shortly after the whole family was taken to the NIH, Henry attacked his wife and tried to strangle her and was restrained by the staff and placed in a straitjacket. He died soon after that. Complications of obesity and adult onset diabetes. And what is the lesson to be learned from all this? None of the relentless testing performed by the NIH researchers brought mankind 1 inch closer to understanding the etiology of schizophrenia or of devising a cure. The story of the Jeannine Sisters still is being cited as evidence for the hereditary nature of schizophrenia, which is absurd. It's not as if there was a control group of 4 more genetically identical sisters who were not subject to years and years of abuse. The problem with family studies, and remember, twin studies are just a subset of family studies, is that family members share an enormous amount of environmental variation in common, making it impossible to disentangle the twin threads of heredity and environment. Adoption studies have been touted as a way of disentangling those threads. By far the most famous of these studies is the Danish adoption study, so it's worth examining in some detail. This study was performed by the aforementioned David Rosenthal of the National Institute of Mental Health and numerous colleagues of his in both the United States and Denmark. That country was chosen as the locus for the study due to its small size, homogeneous population, and meticulous record keeping. The index adoptees consisted of 76 cases who had a birth mother who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and who had been adopted at an early age by non-relatives. The control group consisted of 67 cases, matched to the index adoptees in terms of sex, age, socioeconomic status of the adoptive parents, and time spent with the biological family. The researchers reported that the subjects were contacted and asked to come in for an extensive 3 to 5 hour interview with a psychiatrist. Not all these subjects were happy about being contacted. When a psychiatrist arrived at the home of one would-be interview subject, her husband sicked his dog on the researcher. Nevertheless, let's take a look at what the researchers found. Among the 76 index cases, there was 1 who had received a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now, there was no control group from the general population, but we've already seen that the consensus figure for the lifetime incidence of a diagnosis of schizophrenia appears to be on the order of about 1 in 100. So if there was no difference between the index cases and the general population, far and away the likeliest result we would expect would be 1 case of schizophrenia. And that is what the researchers found. The Danish adoption study found no correlation between a diagnosis of schizophrenia and having a schizophrenic birth mother. Now, at this point, the researchers could have closed up shop and said, okay, we have our answer. There is no strong genetic component to schizophrenia. But they didn't do that. Instead, they extended their analysis to index cases not just with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but also of so-called schizophreniform disorders, which included schizophrenic-like border cases, borderline schizophrenia, paranoid borderline, psychotic borderline, close to borderline psychotic, conceivably paranoid borderline, schizophrenic diathesis with some doubt, pronounced pre-psychotic features, suspicion of organic brain syndrome, schizoid beginning schizophrenia, question mark, and moderately schizoid. What was the researchers' justification for widening the diagnostic net to include this grab bag of ill-defined categories? David Rosenthal himself answered the question in a 1972 paper. If we had relied only on hardcore processed cases, we would have found no significant difference between our index and control cases. That is an astonishing admission. But there were no more astonishing admissions to come. In 1974, the authors reported that the difference in the rate of quote-unquote schizophreniform disorders between the index adoptees and the control subjects was not significant at the 5% level, although it was significant at the 10% level. Close enough, right? But 4 years later, Rosenthal and his colleagues reanalyzed their own data. They assembled a panel of independent psychiatrists to evaluate detailed summaries of the interviews for 64 index cases and 64 matched controls. This time they found no difference between the index cases and the control cases in the rate of quote-unquote schizophrenic disorders. That is another astonishing admission. The researchers were saying their own diagnoses of schizophreniform disorders were not reliable. Now, other researchers have pointed out more gaping holes in the Danish adoption study, and again, we don't have time to go into them all, so we'll just hit on some of the more important points. Perhaps the most astonishing revelation concerned the diagnostic interviews, which formed the basis of the study. In 1994, it was revealed that some of these interviews never took place. Some of these subjects were unavailable or even long dead by the time the study was carried out, in which case the psychiatrist would prepare a quote-unquote pseudo-interview basing his answers on whatever hints he might glean from the patient's hospital records. The fact that some of these interviews were fabricated was never mentioned in any of the published reports. Other quote-unquote interviews consisted of a 5-minute doorstep conversation. It was also revealed that 1 out of 4 of the adoptive families of the index cases had at least one parent hospitalized for mental illness, whereas none of the control families had. This is a blatant violation of the principles of the case control study, which stipulate that there must be no difference between the index and control cases other than the variable under investigation. Reading the papers of Rosenthal and its colleagues, it's hard to avoid the impression that they saw their job as finding some way to torture the data until it appeared to be telling them what they wanted to hear. They said as much. And yet, in the final analysis, literally, they came up empty-handed. The results of the Danish adoption study were negative. And this brings us to the main point concerning adoption studies in general. Adoption agencies were not set up to conduct controlled experiments for psychiatrists and psychologists. That's not their function. Anybody who knows anything about life as it is lived is going to be able to figure out that the children who are judged most desirable are going to be placed with the families judged most desirable. We've already seen this principle at work in the Danish adoption study, in which there was a huge excess of mental problems in the adoptive families of the index cases. The central assumption underlying adoption studies, that adoption randomizes environmental variation, is false. And this brings us to the molecular biology era. Now, we don't have time to go into linkage studies or candidate gene studies, other than to mention that the researchers, by their own admission, have come up completely empty-handed. So let's just fast forward ahead to the modern era of genome-wide association studies, or GWAS studies, as those in the know call them. In GWAS studies, the DNA of persons with a condition of interest, in this case schizophrenia, is sequenced and compared to that of control subjects for the presence of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. A typical study might look at tens of thousands of index subjects and tens of thousands of control subjects, and as many as 1 million or more SNPs, in order to find genetic variations correlated with the condition of interest. In order to eliminate false positives, levels of significance typically are set at p equals 5 times 10 to the minus 8, corresponding to the customary level of p equals 5% divided by 1 million. These techniques have enabled researchers to go over the human genome with a fine-toothed comb. And what have these researchers found? In 2007, the Schizophrenia Working Group of the Psychiatric Genetics Consortium was formed, comprising over 300 researchers in 35 different countries on 4 continents. And they examined the DNA of 36,000 index subjects and 113,000 controls. And in 2014, they announced their findings in the journal Nature. 108 loci associated with schizophrenia. But to the consternation of some of these researchers, the reported effect sizes were tiny, with odds ratios on the order of 1.2 or even less, corresponding to a relative increase in risk of 20% or even less. Now, we've already noted that the consensus figure for the lifetime incidence of a diagnosis of schizophrenia is on the order of 1 in 100. 20% of 1% is 1 in 500. So we're talking about a claim, an absolute increase in risk on the order of 1 in 500, or even less. I once asked a top schizophrenia genetics researcher, suppose you took a test and you found that you had a gene correlated with a 1 in 500 increase in the chance of being diagnosed with schizophrenia, what would you do differently? He said, probably nothing. And the chairman's giving me the 5-minute warning, so let's just fast forward ahead to the last slide. What has a century of psychiatric genetics research accomplished? It certainly has not given us any new diagnostic tests or cures for any of those conditions called mental illnesses. More than 80 years later, Coleman's promises in this area remain entirely unfulfilled. So what has it told us? It's told us that these conditions tend to run in families, which is not very surprising. And it's also told us that a small part of the susceptibility to these conditions may be inherited, which is also not very surprising. And it's also told us that some of these researchers were hell-bent on having people think schizophrenia has a genetic cause, regardless of what their own data was telling them. And all this is a preposterous distraction from the well-known causes of these conditions, which have their roots in child sexual abuse and every other form of adverse childhood experience. Let's return to the most famous case history in all of psychiatric genetics, the Jeannine Sisters. Neither David Rosenthal nor any of the other 25 researchers involved in the preparation of this volume ever asks the obvious question: who wouldn't be crazy after surviving that horror show of a childhood? Thank you.